The story of California does not begin with a map or a ship or a shovel hitting the earth. It begins in the ink and parchment of a Spanish library inside the pages of a runaway bestseller. In the year 1510, a decade before the world would hear the name of Hernán Cortez, a man named García Rodríguez de Montalvo published a chivalric romance titled Las Sergas de Esplandian. It was a tale of knights, dragons, and holy wars, but buried within its pages was a description of a land that would capture the European imagination for centuries. Montalvo wrote of an island called California, situated on the right hand of the Indies, very close to the terrestrial paradise. The author described California as a place populated entirely by women, living without a single man among them, ruled by a majestic and fierce warrior queen named Calafia. In the author's imagination, the island was rugged and unconquerable. Its cliffs were made of solid gold, and its inhabitants rode into battle on the backs of griffins, mythical beasts that they fed with the men they captured from passing ships. To the Spanish mind of the 16th century, the line between the discovered world and the mythical world was incredibly thin. Christopher Columbus himself had sailed into the Caribbean, convinced he was on the doorstep of the Garden of Eden. The conquistadors were not just soldiers, they were readers of these romances. They grew up on stories of hidden kingdoms and fountain of youth myths. When they looked at the horizon of the Pacific Ocean, they were not just looking for land, they were looking for the book to come to life. When Hernán Cortez arrived in Mexico and toppled the Aztec Empire, the sheer amount of gold he found only served to validate these legends. If a city of gold could exist in the highlands of Mexico, why could it not be possible that the island of the Amazons existed just a few hundred miles to the northwest? The search for California was, in its earliest form, a literary treasure hunt. The name California was applied to the maps of the New World not because of a royal decree, but because the explorers were so convinced they had found the fabled island. They simply gave it the name of the fictional paradise they had already memorized. The transition from fiction to geography began in earnest in 1535. Cortez, lured by the promise of pearls and the legendary Queen Calafia, led an expedition to the sun-scorched bay he named Santa Cruz, what we now know as La Paz on the Baja Peninsula. The transition from fiction to geography was far from easy. When Hernán Cortez first stepped onto the shores of the Baja Peninsula in 1535, he was not just looking for a new territory, he was looking for the literal fulfillment of the romance novels he had read. He called the bay Santa Cruz, and for a brief moment the dream of Queen Calafia seemed within reach. But the environment was a shock to the Spanish system. The heat was oppressive, the soil was barren and rocky, there were no golden palaces, and there were certainly no griffins. However, the explorers did find something that kept the dream alive. In the shallow, turquoise waters of the Gulf, they found pearls. These were not ordinary pearls. They were large, luminous, and often possessed a unique silver or black tint that made them world famous. This discovery sparked a period known as Pearl Fever. It transformed California from a mythical island of gold into a very real, very profitable site of colonial industry. But this wealth came with a heavy cost. The Spanish began to exploit the local indigenous people, forcing them to dive into shark-infested waters to retrieve the treasures of the seabed. Because of the abundance of pearls, the island myth actually grew stronger instead of fading away. The reasoning was simple. In the mind of a 16th century navigator, pearls were a sign of a tropical, isolated paradise. If there were pearls, there must be a sea separating this land from the cold main continent. This led to one of the greatest geographical blunders in history. Explorers like Francisco de Ulloa sailed to the very northern neck of the Gulf, where the Colorado River meets the sea. He found only mud and shallow water, proving there was no passage through. Yet the maps in Europe did not change. The world preferred the island. Mapmakers in London and Amsterdam continued to draw California as a massive, carrot-shaped island floating in the Pacific. They believed it was a fortress protecting the secret Northwest Passage, a shortcut to the riches of China and India. For over a century, the reality of the desert peninsula was ignored in favor of the profitable myth of the island. This era solidified California's reputation as a place where the truth is often secondary to the dream. It was a land defined not by its borders, but by the desires of those who looked toward its horizon from afar. As the 17th century progressed, the myth of the island began to clash with the necessity of the mission. The Spanish crown wanted more than just pearls. They wanted a permanent presence to protect their shipping lanes from English and Dutch pirates. This task fell to the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. One man in particular, Father Eusebio Kino, would become the first to truly challenge the mapmakers. Kino was a cartographer himself, trained in the rigorous scientific traditions of Europe, but he was also a man of deep faith, who spent decades walking the dry heat of the Sonoran Desert. Father Kino's primary goal was to find a land route into California. If California were an island, the missions would always be dependent on dangerous, expensive sea voyages for supplies. But if it were connected to the mainland, the Spanish could drive cattle and transport goods by land. Starting in 1698, Kino led a series of expeditions to the mouth of the Colorado River. He stood on the high peaks of the Panacate Mountains and looked across the haze of the horizon. He did not see a sea. He saw a land bridge, a continuous stretch of earth connecting the desert to the peninsula. Kino famously wrote a treatise titled A Passage by Land to California. In it, he provided detailed maps based on his own footsteps, proving that the island theory was a physical impossibility. This was a turning point in the history of the West. It changed the strategic value of the region overnight. However, the world was slow to listen. Despite Kino's first-hand evidence, the Spanish authorities were hesitant to update their official records, and many European mapmakers simply ignored his findings. The myth of the island was too embedded in the culture to be erased by a single man's journey. The struggle between Kino's reality and the world's fantasy lasted for decades. It wasn't until 1746, more than 40 years after Kino's death, that King Ferdinand VI of Spain finally issued a royal decree stating definitively that California was not an island, but by then the island had already become a part of the California identity. It was a place of isolation, a place of unique flora and fauna, and a place where a new kind of society could be built. The land bridge was found, but the psychological feeling of being an island, separate from the rest of the continent, would remain a core part of the California spirit. By the mid-18th century, the Spanish crown was gripped by a new fear. The Russian Empire was moving down the Pacific coast from Alaska, and the British were eyeing the western shores of North America. To secure their claim, Spain launched the Sacred Expedition of 1769. This was not a search for mythical queens or pearls, but a desperate race to occupy the land. Led by the soldier Gaspar de Portolá and the Franciscan friar Junipero Serra, two groups set out, one by sea and one by land. Their destination was the legendary harbor of Monterey, which had not been visited by Europeans for over 160 years. The journey was a grueling test of human endurance. The land party struggled through the rugged terrain of northern Baja, while the ships were battered by contrary winds and ravaged by scurvy. When they finally reunited at the site of present-day San Diego, nearly half of the men had perished. Despite the losses, Father Serra stayed behind to found the first mission, San Diego de Alcalá, while Portolá pushed north with a small group of soldiers. They were looking for the sheltered bay described by earlier explorers, but they were about to find something far more significant than they ever imagined. As Portolá's group moved north, they actually overshot Monterey because it didn't look like the paradise described in the old, exaggerated logs. Instead, while searching for their destination, they crested a ridge and became the first Europeans to lay eyes on the San Francisco Bay. It was a massive inland sea, hidden for centuries by the coastal fog. However, to Portolá, it was a disappointment. It was an obstacle in his path back to San Diego. It would take years for the Spanish to realize they had discovered one of the finest natural harbors in the world, a gateway that would eventually change the course of global history. The Sacred Expedition succeeded in establishing a chain of missions and presidios that would become the backbone of modern California. From San Diego to San Francisco, the landscape began to change as the Spanish introduced European crops, cattle, and architecture. This era marked the end of California as a cartographic ghost and the beginning of its life as a settled territory. But it was also the start of a deep and painful transformation for the indigenous peoples, whose ancient way of life was now on a direct collision course with the ambitions of a dying empire. The dream of the island was officially over, but the era of the missions had begun. The year 1821 brought a seismic shift to the west. Mexico won its independence from Spain, and the distant territory of California found itself under a new flag. The new Mexican government viewed the vast mission lands not as religious centers, but as wasted economic potential. Through the Secularization Act, the missions were stripped of their power and their property was redistributed. This gave birth to the era of the Ranchos' massive land grants, some covering hundreds of thousands of acres, given to influential families known as the Californios. Names like Vallejo, Pico, and Alvarado became the new royalty of the coast. Life on the ranchos was governed by the horse and the lasso. The economy was built almost entirely on cattle, but not for their meat. Because there was no refrigeration, the value lay in the hides and the fat, known as tallow. This California banknotes economy drew trading ships from New England, creating a global link between the remote Pacific coast and the factories of Boston. The Californios lived a life of legendary hospitality, where a traveler could ride from San Diego to Sonoma and always find a fresh horse and a warm bed waiting for them at the next great estate. This period also saw the first trickles of foreign influence that would eventually become a flood. Trappers like Jedediah Smith crossed the Sierra Nevada mountains, proving that the continent could be breached from the east. Sailors who jumped ship, like John Rogers Cooper, married into Californio families and became successful merchants. The Mexican government grew increasingly wary of these foreigners, particularly the Americans, who seemed to view California not as a neighbor's property, but as their own manifest destiny. The tension between the easygoing rancho lifestyle and the driving ambition of the pioneers began to tighten. By the 1840s, the rancho era reached its breathtaking peak. It was a culture defined by equestrian skill, elaborate silver-mounted saddles, and week-long celebrations. But beneath the surface, the political foundations were crumbling. Mexico was too far away to govern effectively, and the Californios were often at odds with the governors sent from Mexico City. In the shadows, a Swiss immigrant named John Sutter was building a private empire in the Sacramento Valley, and a group of American settlers was preparing for a rebellion. The era of the Dons was about to meet the crushing force of a new era, one born of iron, steam, and gold. By the mid-1840s, California was a powder keg waiting for a spark. American settlers, many of whom had entered the territory illegally, were increasingly fearful that the Mexican authorities would expel them. In June of 1846, that spark arrived in the form of a small group of rugged frontiersmen in Sonoma. They seized the garrison of the retired General Mariano Vallejo and declared a new sovereign nation, the California Republic. To represent their movement, they fashioned a crude flag out of a piece of white cotton and a strip of red flannel, painting a star and a grizzly bear on the fabric. This was the birth of the Bear Flag Revolt. The revolt was short-lived as an independent movement, but its timing was perfect. Unbeknownst to the settlers in Sonoma, the United States and Mexico had already declared war over a boundary dispute in Texas. When the American naval fleet arrived in Monterey and San Francisco, the Bear Flaggers quickly lowered their homemade banner and raised the stars and stripes. The local skirmish was instantly absorbed into the much larger Mexican-American War. John C. Fremont, a charismatic and controversial explorer, took command of a volunteer battalion, turning the ragtag group of settlers into a formal military force. While the northern part of the territory fell relatively quickly, the south proved much more difficult to subdue. The Californios were skilled horsemen and fierce defenders of their land. At the Battle of San Pascual, near San Diego, the Lancers of Andres Pico dealt a bloody defeat to the American Dragoons, led by General Stephen Kearny. It was a reminder that California would not be surrendered without a fight. For months, a series of battles and sieges raged across the southern ranchos, from Los Angeles to the hills of Montebello, as the Mexican defenders utilized their superior knowledge of the terrain to harass the invading forces. The conflict finally came to an end in January of 1847 with the Treaty of Cahuenga, followed a year later by the formal Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mexico ceded nearly half of its territory to the United States, including the vast prize of California. In exchange, the United States paid $15 million. The era of the ranchos and the Mexican governors was over, and the era of American statehood was about to begin. However, as the ink was drying on the treaties, a discovery was made in a cold mountain stream that would ensure California would never be a quiet frontier again. In January of 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall was supervising the construction of a sawmill for John Sutter on the American River. While checking the tail race, he spotted a few glittering flakes in the cold mountain water. He gathered the samples and took them to Sutter, where they tested the metal with lye and hammers. It was gold. Sutter, fearing the discovery would ruin his agricultural empire, tried to keep it a secret, but a secret of that magnitude could not be contained. When Samuel Brannan ran through the streets of San Francisco waving a vial of gold dust, the town emptied overnight. The greatest mass migration in American history had begun. By 1849, the 49ers were arriving from every corner of the globe, They came by sea around Cape Horn, they trekked across the deadly Isthmus of Panama, and they braved the overland trails in covered wagons. This was California's first true international era. Men arrived from China, Chile, France, and the eastern United States, all hoping to strike it rich in the mother lode. Tent cities like Sacramento and Stockton sprouted from the mud, serving as supply hubs for the thousands of miners heading into the Sierra foothills. The social hierarchy of the Old World was discarded. In the diggings, a man's worth was measured by his strength and the yield of his pan. The early days of placer mining were followed by more industrial and destructive methods. When the easy gold in the riverbeds ran out, miners turned to hydraulic mining, using high-pressure water cannons to wash away entire hillsides. This sent millions of tons of silt into the rivers, flooding the valleys below and causing the first major environmental crisis in the West. While a lucky few found massive nuggets and became kings of the hill, the vast majority of miners found only backbreaking labor and debt. The real wealth was often made by the merchants who sold the picks, the jeans, and the eggs, men like Levi Strauss and Leland Stanford. The gold rush acted as a forge, hammering California into a state in record time. Without ever becoming a formal U.S. territory, California applied for statehood in 1850. The wealth from the mines funded a cultural explosion, turning San Francisco into the Paris of the Pacific, filled with grand hotels and opera houses. But the era also had a dark side. The indigenous population was decimated by violence and disease, and the old Californio families saw their land titles challenged and stripped away by the new American legal system. The island of myth had become a land of gold, but for many, the cost of that gold was higher than anyone could have imagined. Even after the gold rush, California remained a lonely outpost, separated from the east by months of travel. The dream of a transcontinental railroad was considered a fool's errand, until a brilliant engineer named Theodore Judah mapped a route through the treacherous Sierra Nevada. He convinced 4 Sacramento merchants, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, to invest. These men, known as the Big Four, formed the Central Pacific Railroad. They were not railroaders by trade, but they were masters of finance and political influence, and they were about to build the most ambitious infrastructure project in American history. The construction was a battle against nature itself. While the Union Pacific built westward across the flat plains, the Central Pacific had to carve a path through solid granite. When white laborers deserted the tracks for the silver mines of Nevada, Charles Crocker turned to Chinese immigrants. These workers faced brutal conditions, hand-drilling tunnels through the mountains and working through winter storms that dumped 30 feet of snow. Despite the prejudice and the deadly hazards, the Chinese crews proved to be the most disciplined and effective workforce on the line, laying the tracks that would finally bridge the continent. The two railroads finally met at Promontory Summit, Utah, in May of 1869. With the driving of the Golden Spike, the journey from New York to San Francisco was reduced from 6 months to just 6 days. For California, the impact was immediate and overwhelming. The island was finally physically part of the Union. Goods from the east flooded the market, and California's agricultural products, citrus, wheat, and wine, could finally be shipped to the hungry markets of the Atlantic. However, the railroad also brought a new kind of tyranny. The Big Four used their monopoly to control nearly every aspect of California life, from the price of wheat to the outcome of elections. They became known as the Octopus, a nickname later popularized by novelist Frank Norris to describe how the railroad's reach strangled the independent farmer. This era of corporate dominance sparked a wave of populism and reform that would define California politics for decades. The Iron Horse had conquered the mountains and ended the isolation, but it had also created a power structure that would take a generation to dismantle. At the dawn of the 20th century, Los Angeles was a sunny, ambitious town with a major problem. It was outgrowing its local water supply. The city's survival fell into the hands of William Mulholland, a self-taught engineer who had risen from a ditch digger to the head of the water department. Mulholland realized that for Los Angeles to become a great city, it would have to reach across the desert to the Owens Valley, over 200 miles away. Along with former Mayor Fred Eaton, Mulholland devised a plan to divert the Owens River into a massive aqueduct, effectively draining a fertile farming valley to quench the thirst of a growing coastal desert. The construction of the Los Angeles Aqueduct was an engineering marvel, second only to the Panama Canal at the time. It relied entirely on gravity, using no pumping stations to move water over mountains and across the Mojave Desert. When the water finally reached the San Fernando Valley in 1913, Mulholland stood before a crowd of thousands and gave the shortest, most famous speech in California history. "There it is. Take it." This water sparked a real estate boom that turned dusty ranchlands into the suburbs of Hollywood and Beverly Hills. But in the Owens Valley, the river went dry, the orchards withered, and a bitter, decades-long conflict known as the California Water Wars began. The theft of the Owens River was not just a local dispute, it was a blueprint for the future of the state. It proved that in California, geography was not destiny, engineering was. The Owens Valley farmers fought back with dynamite, blowing up sections of the aqueduct in a desperate attempt to save their way of life. But the sheer economic and political power of Los Angeles was too great. The conflict eventually inspired the classic film Chinatown, cementing the idea in the American psyche that California's growth was built on a foundation of secret deals and diverted rivers. Water became the state's most precious and contested commodity, more valuable than the gold of the previous century. The success of the Los Angeles Aqueduct paved the way for even grander projects, including the damming of the Tuolumne River to provide water for San Francisco and the eventual tapping of the Colorado River. These massive plumbing systems allowed California to support tens of millions of people and a multi-billion-dollar agricultural industry. However, it also created a permanent state of tension between the urban centers of the South and the rural water sources of the North. The island of myth had become an oasis of artifice, a civilization sustained by a fragile and complex network of concrete and steel. At the start of the 20th century, the center of the film industry was actually in New Jersey and New York. But the early movie moguls were fleeing two things: the unpredictable East Coast weather and the restrictive patents of Thomas Edison. They found their sanctuary in a sleepy teetotaler community called Hollywood. Here, the sun shone 300 days a year, and the landscape offered everything from deserts and mountains to Mediterranean coastlines within a day's drive. By 1915, the silent film era was in full swing, and a small patch of agricultural land was rapidly transforming into the world's capital of storytelling. Hollywood didn't just make movies, it manufactured a new identity for California. The Dream Factory projected an image of eternal youth, palm trees, and boundless opportunity. This was the era of the first movie stars, larger-than-life figures like Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks, whose lifestyles became the envy of the world. As the studio system grew, giants like Warner Brothers, MGM, and Paramount built massive backlots that were cities unto themselves. California was no longer just a place on a map, it was a state of mind, a shimmering frontier where anyone, regardless of their past, could reinvent themselves under the spotlight. The impact of Hollywood reached far beyond the screen. It drove a massive real estate and tourism boom as millions of people moved west, hoping to catch a glimpse of the glamour or perhaps a break in the industry. This influx of creative energy turned Los Angeles into a laboratory for modern architecture, fashion, and lifestyle. However, the myth-making had a shadow. For every star born, thousands of dreams were shattered. The industry was often ruthless, and the paradise projected on screen frequently masked a reality of labor struggles and social exclusion. The very stories that drew people to California often omitted the complex history of those who were already there. By the time the golden age of Hollywood reached its peak in the 1930s and 40s, California had become the world's primary exporter of culture. The Hollywood sign, originally a real estate advertisement for Hollywood land, became a global icon of aspiration. This era cemented the idea that California was the place where the future happened first. Whether through the escapism of a musical or the grit of a film noir, Hollywood taught the world how to dream in a Californian accent. The island of myth had finally found its most powerful form, a flickering image on a silver screen. The 1930s brought a different kind of migration to California. As the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl ravaged the American heartland, hundreds of thousands of people, displaced farmers from Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas, loaded their lives into beat-up Fords and headed west. They were lured by handbills promising work in the fields, but they arrived to find a state overwhelmed by poverty and labor surplus. These Okies were often met with hostility and bum blockades at the border. This era, immortalized by John Steinbeck in The Grapes of Wrath, highlighted the stark contrast between the California myth of abundance and the harsh reality of the migrant labor camps. Despite the economic darkness, California embarked on some of its most iconic engineering projects during this time. The Golden Gate Bridge and the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge were completed in the mid-30s, standing as monuments to human will during an age of despair. These bridges were more than just transportation links, They were symbols of a state that refused to stop building toward the future. At the same time, the Central Valley Project began to reshape the interior of the state, creating a massive system of dams and canals that would turn California into the most productive agricultural region on the planet. The outbreak of the Second World War changed everything almost overnight. California's geography made it the primary staging ground for the Pacific Theater. From the shipyards of Richmond to the aircraft factories of Burbank and Santa Monica, the state became the arsenal of democracy. This industrial explosion created a desperate need for labor, drawing millions of new residents, including a massive migration of African Americans from the South. Cities like Oakland, Long Beach, and San Diego doubled in size. The war effort effectively ended the Great Depression in California, replacing the breadlines with high-paying factory jobs and a booming middle class. However, the war also brought one of the darkest chapters in the state's history. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Executive Order 9066 led to the forced removal and incarceration of over 100,000 Japanese Americans, many of whom were California citizens. They were stripped of their homes and businesses and sent to desolate camps like Manzanar in the high desert. This wartime hysteria stood in painful contradiction to the values of freedom the nation was fighting for abroad. When the war finally ended in 1945, California emerged as a changed land, heavily industrialized, ethnically diverse, and ready to lead the world into the atomic age. In the years following World War II, California's massive aerospace and defense industries created a unique environment of high-tech innovation. The orchards of the Santa Clara Valley, once famous for prunes and apricots, began to sprout a new kind of fruit, the semiconductor. This transformation was led by visionaries like Frederick Terman of Stanford University, who encouraged his students to start their own companies rather than head east. With the founding of Fairchild Semiconductor and later Intel, the region was dubbed Silicon Valley. It became a place where the garage was the new prospector's claim, and a brilliant idea was the new mother lode. The 1960s and 70s saw California become the epicenter of a cultural and technological revolution. While the Summer of Love in San Francisco challenged social norms, the engineers in the South Bay were quietly building the personal computer. Figures like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak at Apple and the researchers at Xerox PARC reimagined how humans interact with machines. California was once again at the right hand of the Indies, but this time the riches weren't in the mountains. They were in the silicon chips and the lines of code that would eventually connect every person on the planet. As the 20th century turned into the 21st, California's economy grew to be the fifth largest in the world, outperforming most sovereign nations. The state became a pioneer in environmental policy, renewable energy, and civil rights, often setting the pace for the rest of the United States. However, the modern era also brought significant challenges. The island myth returned in a new form, a growing divide between the immense wealth of the tech sector and the rising cost of living that has pushed many to the margins. The state's ancient struggles with drought and wildfire have become more urgent, forcing a new generation to rethink how we live in balance with a beautiful but unforgiving landscape. 500 years after Montalvo first wrote about the fictional island of Queen Calafia, the story of California remains a work in progress. It is a place that has been continuously reinvented by the conquistadors, the mission friars, the gold seekers, the dreamers of Hollywood, and the architects of the digital age. California has always been more than just a territory. It is an idea, a laboratory for the human experience, and a land where the horizon is always moving. The search for California continues, not on a map of the world, but in the collective imagination of those who still look west and see a place where anything is possible. We look back now at the map of 1510, at the fictional island of Queen Calafia, and we realize that the explorers were not entirely wrong. California has always functioned as an island geographically isolated by the Sierra Nevada and the Mojave, and psychologically isolated by its own relentless ambition. It is a place where the rules of the old world have never quite applied. From the first Spanish mission to the first moon rocket, California has been defined by the audacity of those who believe that the future can be designed, built, and sold. The story of this land is not a single narrative, but a collision of many. It is the story of the indigenous people who first shaped this earth, the Spanish who named it, the Mexicans who claimed it, and the millions of immigrants who continue to redefine it. It is a land of profound contradictions, a place of unimaginable wealth and crushing poverty, a garden of abundance and a desert of drought, a dream factory that projects hope while struggling with its own reality. These tensions are the engine of California's creativity. They are the reason the world still looks to this coast to see what happens next. As we stand on the edge of the Pacific today, the frontier has changed once again. It is no longer found in the gold of the mountains or the soil of the valleys. The new frontier exists in the transition to a sustainable future, in the exploration of the stars, and in the deepening understanding of our own diverse society. The island is now part of a global network, but it remains a laboratory for the human spirit. The challenges of climate, housing, and equality are the new mountains we must climb, and the spirit of the 1849 prospector or the 1900s engineer is still required to navigate them. California remains, as it has always been, a land of second chances. Whether you are a writer in a Hollywood bungalow, a scientist in a laboratory, or a farm worker in the Central Valley, you are part of a 500-year-old experiment. The myth of California was born in a book, but it is written every day in the lives of those who call it home. The island is not a place you find on a map, it is a place you build, and as long as there are dreamers looking toward the sunset, the story of California will never truly be finished.